With Disclosure Day, Steven Spielberg returns to cinemas for the first time in 3 years, and to the science fiction genre for the first time since 2005's War of the Worlds. So, is this his alien magnum opus, or just perfectly mid? That is what we'll be discussing in this episode of Snack Break. And welcome to episode 22 of Snack Break, the perfect podcast pop on while preparing a cup of tea or ideal snack or beverage. Coming up on this episode, we're going to be discussing all things Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day, including my full review of the film itself, as well as a spoiler discussion. So be warned, that will be aptly pointed out when it's on its way, but there will be spoilers at some point in this episode. After that, well, we're also going to be talking one of the biggest stories in UK radio news this year. Zoe Ball is going to be moving to Greatest Hits Radio for a brand new afternoon show starting this autumn. We're going to be discussing all of that on this week's episode of Snack Break. Enjoy! With Disclosure Day, Steven Spielberg returns to cinemas for the first time in 3 years, and to the science fiction genre for the first time since 2005's War of the Worlds. So, is this his alien magnum opus, or just perfectly mid? Well, it's certainly not perfect. It's important to note from the beginning that this, if nothing else, deserves immense credit for being one of the most technically impressive films of the summer. Spielberg once again embraced the blockbuster genre with full dedication, with shots often both immensely impressive in their movement and cinematography, with longtime Spielberg cinematographer Janusz Kaminski returned for this film and delivering shots with artistic flair that are crucially not overly distracting. I believe he did Schindler's List, so not super surprising that he's returned for this film. The general story is also one of the film's greatest strengths. Throughout the film, I could not help but be delighted by how mysteries are delightfully staggered, maintaining engagement with a combination of action and concept that results in a story that is, overall, pretty thrilling. Overall, unfortunately, however, is the key word here. The majority of the mysteries that this film relies on are played incredibly well until about 75% of the way through their resolution, at which point they often fall apart in confusing and often nonsensical finales. It's a shame that irritates me greatly, as the overall concept and stories within this film are so brilliant, but the finale of just about every major plot point here is largely pretty lackluster. Furthermore, this film is incredibly slow. There were genuinely points throughout this film where I wondered whether I had misread the time on the Omniplex app and had in fact signed up for a 3¼ hour extravaganza. This was not the case, however, and the film is instead a lengthy 2 hours and 25 minutes. That's not helped by the fact that only one of the 3 point of views within the opening hour is actually that interesting. For anyone who cares, I thought the sort of Emily Blunt and he plays John Walker, and Wyatt Russell, the Emily Blunt and Wyatt Russell perspective for the first hour or so, I thought was the most engaging one, but generally just wasn't that interested in what was going on with the other perspectives, even though there were, trace that a bit better, even though there were certainly interesting plot points going on within those other characters' points of views, I just wasn't that engaged on the whole, sadly. Additionally, scenes that, although very well realised, are monologue heavy within the first hour and needlessly long, generally slowing the overall engagement. Overall, Spielberg's Disclosure Day isn't a flawed masterpiece, but a brilliant display of what could have been a masterpiece. There's so much to love here. A brilliant concept and story, beautiful cinematography and shots, although I would note with regards to the shots, I think that some people do seem to be finding them sick-making. Certainly the family member I went to see them with found sort of the overall, almost over the top, quite intense movements within the film and within the film's shots. They found them be a bit sick-making, so just word warn anybody who would be inclined to often find movies that way. You could find that with this film, as well as a genuinely engaging character and emotive work. And I do love these elements, enough for me to still look back on this film in a very positive light. I do want to emphasize that. I really, really enjoyed these bits, and bits of it were very, very cool. But ultimately, I found that my overall experience was significantly detracted from by slow pace, the wasting and safeguarding of the most interesting characters, loose plot points, and a generally unsatisfying conclusion. Disclosure Day is still a very good film by the master of modern cinema, but in my opinion, one that could have been great. We're now going to be moving on to the spoiler discussion for Disclosure Day, so take this as your spoiler warning. Wow, spoiler, spoiler, spoiler. Because from this point henceforth, we are going to be talking about spoilers in all their spoilerish glory for Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day. I'm just going to run down in non-chronological order a lot of the big spoilers I want to talk about here. I've just got some basic notes with regards to these. I had a pretty big issue, to be honest, with the alien design. I just didn't really get it. I didn't perhaps there is an argument that it was integral to that it didn't really, because we find out in a way so little about the aliens, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this episode. Perhaps it could be argued that having the sort of generic alien design, or at least admittedly a modification of the generic alien design, but definitely still something akin to the typical alien design, perhaps having that was integral to maintaining the idea that this isn't really about the aliens itself. It's much more about this fight for freedom and truth and how humanity interacts with these discoveries that the film was talking about in its title of Disclosure Day. It still wasn't something I was super happy with. I thought with all the, millions upon millions of pounds used to make this movie, they maybe could have come up with something a little bit more different. Again, no hate to anybody involved with this movie. It still looks very good as a design in itself. It's just not the design I would have gone for personally. It's sort of a little bit like you took E.T., made him white, stretched him, and made the eyes big. For my personal liking, it wasn't quite to my taste. Additionally, on the topic of aliens, those ending 10 minutes were, in so many ways for me personally, the best and worst of this movie. Because on the one hand, everything that is going on with the footage and like leaking it to the world, that's so exciting. You've had what, as I mentioned in my review, has often felt like a slow, in both good ways and bad ways, build up to this point. So very, very excited, obviously, to get to this point where all this has been revealed. So those were such an exciting 10 minutes. But to eventually get to that point where the final moment is just listen. I haven't even bothered to Google yet what that means or what that's supposed to be alluding to, because it did leave me to feel, just sort of be leaving the cinema with such a sense of like shocked, quite hilarious in a way, because it was just like, what on earth? Shocked disappointment. And I honestly couldn't believe it when she sat in front of, because obviously it was very clear the film was leading up to the final section of the film in those concluding 10 minutes. But when she just sat there and went, listen, into the camera, and there was that black screen, I genuinely waited with bated breath to see if that would be the conclusion. And I was just absolutely shocked when the screen turned black and we saw that iconic directed by Steven Spielberg. Absolutely shocked. And I'm sure there's some great in-depth reasoning about why exactly that was the chosen conclusion. But after 2 hours and 25 minutes, I know I keep coming back to the length, but I just didn't always feel that was... at times that felt like it was so used so incredibly well, but as I mentioned in my main review, but in other times felt like it really wasn't. So to go through 2 hours and 25 minutes to get to that point where that is your final conclusion, I just felt very, very disappointed with that regard of the film, that aspect of the film. I also felt that just having a bit of a clearer rules of the aliens could have been quite helpful. Again, I know there is an argument that the aliens and the actual nature of the aliens themselves aren't that important to this film, but certainly with the sort of alien-esque device that used, we needed a Lord of the Ring style. This is what the ring does. This is what it does to our characters. This is how it interacts with this world in which aliens are coming to Earth. Because I just really felt like that wasn't set up particularly well. There's obviously elements of mystery that are done at times so well throughout this movie, but I just felt like the use of the device wasn't one of them here. Additionally, animal visual effects, very good at points in this movie, but also some of them still have a long way to go. This is not a criticism specifically of this movie. There were bits in Star Wars Mandalorian and Grogu where, on the whole, like Disclosure Day, amazing visuals and visual effect, but just the occasional thing where I was like, oh, that looks a bit weird, a little bit shonky. Some of the animal stuff for this had a similar feeling to that for me. You might not notice it. It's just something I personally noticed. Additionally, just there was a general sense of lingering questions here. Why were these two people chosen? Why was this bestowed upon them? The whole cottage scene is something I keep coming back to, but it's never something that's made entirely clear. And again, you could go and check this out, but I just felt like it's at that point where the mystery is so well established and partially revealed up to about the 75% mark through any given mystery's resolution. And this can come at any point in the movie, but it felt that whenever a mystery was coming up in that final 25% of its resolution, it just lacked a certain definition to where it felt like it just got a bit unclear. And I hate to say it, but just a little bit nonsensical. And that lack of clarity and did lead to, an added sense of disappointment for me personally, which, is always going to be a letdown when a mystery doesn't resolve itself in a particularly satisfying way. And there's a lot of unanswered questions generally, whether it's the aliens, why the aliens were involved, how exactly the alien stuff worked. Again, it doesn't significantly detract from the plot as a whole, because that's not what the film's talking about, in my personal opinion. But it's still something that, again, detract from my enjoyment of the film personally. There's also like a slightly weird political undertone going throughout this movie. I enjoyed it for the most part, but the whole like World War III is on the brink of happening, and also all these Cold War alien connections, there's a slightly bizarre, unexplored political and historically linked tone that's not really explored that much in the film. And if anything, it just makes me want to talk to Steven Spielberg about this film, because I am just so curious about what a lot of the thoughts going into this were. And, it's very clear, and it's been made very clear from a lot of the press stuff, that this aliens and beliefs about aliens and all the different views on aliens is something that Steven Spielberg very clearly has a big interest in. Obviously, the Cold War and Roswell has all these links to it, but would have been something would have maybe been keen to see a bit more of an expansion of, especially in those final 10 minutes where we're seeing all the TV footage. Getting a bit more of that would have been really, really cool. Again, I think the brevity of that sequence does help it, although even just a bit more might have been quite nice. And again, the other big question, just before I wrap up the spoiler section, I'm going slightly out of order here, but the other big question is just, we failed to learn much about the aliens at all. And it is very much a human story, as I keep saying. It's about how we react to this information, but we find out so little about the aliens that it did just feel like an aspect of the world building there was absent to a degree. So overall, those are my spoiler thoughts for Disclosure Day. If you have any spoiler feelings for Disclosure Day, you can drop them in the YouTube or Spotify comments, or you can send them to our email at hwsnackbreakpodcast@gmail.com. We're going to wrap this episode up with something a little bit different. We're going to be talking radio news, or UK-specific radio news, I suppose. The article I'm using here is radiotoday.com. Great website for radio nerds and radio professionals. Generally discuss, I believe there's an Australian version, with Australia being the other big radio nation. But certainly in terms of UK radio news, this is one of the big ones, in my opinion, the best radio news website in the UK. Again, not connected, sponsored or anything, just thought I'd give them a little mention. We're going to be talking, however, a big shake-up in the world of UK radio news. Zoe Ball has bagged a daily show on Greatest Hits Radio. This was just announced yesterday as of recording. Zoe Ball is going to be joining Bauer to host weekday afternoons on Greatest Hits Radio from 1 p.m, I believe, to 4 p.m. Now, this is very big news because Zoe Ball is obviously one of the UK's most well-known broadcasters. And also, it's something that we sort of had suspicions that this was going to be on the way. Even Radio Today podcast discussed that a few weeks ago in a sort of rumoured section, because this came out, I believe it was initially a report from The Sun that suggested that Zoe Ball had entered talks with Bauer, or had signed a deal with Bauer to appear on Greatest Hits Radio. And I have to say, if you asked me a few years ago, as a big radio nerd, if Zoe Ball was ever going to be on Greatest Hits Radio, or at least would Zoe Ball be on Greatest Hits Radio within the next 5 years, I would have definitely said no. Obviously, that was before Zoe Ball left the Radio 2 breakfast show. But I have to say, I always thought that Zoe Ball was certainly within that new generation of Radio 2 presenters. And she definitely was during her time on breakfast. That being said, however, music taste, in terms of what she played on the show, did appear to lean often a little bit more towards Greatest Hits Radio's decade demographic. I believe they're 70s, 80s and 90s. I think some of the stuff Zoe Ball played would even go a little bit older than that. It was a little bit more niche at times. So certainly I think she will be very, very good on Greatest Hits Radio. She obviously left the Radio 2 breakfast show and then went on to do Radio 2 Weekends for just a year. It is known knowledge that she auditioned for Strictly, did not get that. So to see on Greatest Hits Radio is really, really interesting. I have to say, a great move for Greatest Hits Radio on the whole. Again, I have no doubt Zoe Ball will be very, very good at it. She's in between Ken Bruce and Simon Mayo, obviously on middays and sort of Popmaster slot, if you will, and drive time respectively. But I think this is a really, really good move for Greatest Hits Radio, and it's even more firmly asserts them as probably the commercial station in the UK with the biggest star power, because it's common enough for nowadays commercial stations within the UK to have like a very big breakfast star or a very big drive time star, and in all fairness, even prior to Zoe Ball joining, everyone on the Greatest Hits Radio schedule is a celebrity to some degree, but obviously Zoe Ball is very, very well known within UK broadcasting. So this is, arguably a different level to a degree, given that she hosted for many years Europe's biggest radio show, although it was Pembroke's actually during that period, but like Europe's second biggest radio show, hugely successful, bit of a different level in that sense. So I would say that by this point, Greatest Hits Radio definitely have exceeded that expectation for big commercial radio stations to have a big breakfast and drive star. A big question though is who Greatest Hits Radio will be after next, because it's very clear. I would have said Zoe Ball maybe a bit younger than some of the even Greatest Hits Radio's own demographic, although still like they say sort of 40 and up. So I guess she does fit into it there, but younger than some of the other presenters perhaps. Have to say, if I had to hedge bets on who from Radio 2 might go next, Dermot O'Leary, I feel like could finally get a shot at a daytime show. Could be exciting. He'd obviously have to not work Fridays because of this morning, but he's got he's got a slightly older music taste, and additionally has been very popular on Radio 2, but has also been on Radio 2 for over 20 years. So maybe they'll be after him next. I don't know though. Who am I to say? And again, this announcement came several years after Ken Bruce and Greatest Hits Radio. They don't make a ton of regular schedule changes. It could be another few years before we get another major announcement like this. But what are your thoughts on Greatest Hits Radio as a whole, and more importantly, Zoe Ball signing for Zoe Ball in the afternoon on Greatest Hits Radio? You can drop your thoughts in the comments on Spotify or YouTube below, or you can email us at hwsnackbreakpodcast@gmail.com. That is it for this episode of Snack Break, though. Thank you very, very much for listening. I've been Bendigo Blue. This has been a Hungry Capybara production. A bunch of great films coming up over the next few episodes. We've got Masters of the Universe, Supergirl, The Mandalorian and Grogu. Lots of super exciting stuff coming up. So please, if you feel like it, you can give us a follow on the old Spotify, or you can subscribe on YouTube. Thank you very, very much for listening. See you soon. Stay safe. Bye.